There are aches within us that words can't quite describe, wounds too deep, too long-lasting, or too hidden to simply be named. Sometimes, we don't even know what to call them. All we know is that something feels broken. It shows up in the quiet moments, when no one's watching, when we're lying awake in the dark, when a memory surfaces out of nowhere, or when we smile out of habit but feel nothing underneath. There's a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from work, but from carrying unspoken pain for too long. That's the ache this journey speaks to, the kind that settles in the soul, the kind that hides behind performance and politeness, the kind we've told ourselves to ignore. But what if that ache wasn't a sign of failure? What if it was a sacred signal, an invitation to finally turn toward the places we've avoided and ask God not just to fix what hurts, but to truly heal it? Healing isn't about getting back to who you used to be. It's about allowing yourself to become who you were always meant to be, beneath the armor, beyond the trauma, before the breaking. And that kind of healing isn't instant. It's a journey of courage, surrender, and honest conversation with a God who sees what no one else does. So, in this space, let go of the need to be okay. You don't have to explain your pain here. Just breathe. You're not alone. Healing doesn't begin with answers. It begins with presence. And the of God is not reserved for the strong. It meets you exactly where you, with the simple whisper, "Let me in." Before healing can begin, the wound must be acknowledged, not analyzed, not spiritualized away, not minimized with well-meaning phrases or brushed aside by busyness. It must be seen fully. Naming our pain is not weakness. It is a profound act of courage. It is stepping out of denial and into truth, even if our voice shakes. And truth-telling, especially to ourselves, is often the first breath of freedom. We live in a world that rewards hiding, masking what hurts, numbing what lingers, pushing forward as if pretending equals progress. But what we silence doesn't go away. It burrows. It becomes tension in the body, a short temper, a hardened heart, or a quiet emptiness that shows up in our relationships, our faith, and our sense of self. Many of us have walked with pain so long we've mistaken it for personality. We say, "I'm just not emotional," or "I don't trust easily," or "I've moved on," when in truth, we've simply adapted to survive. And survival is noble, but it is not the same as healing. Healing asks something deeper. It asks us to stop and pay attention, to ask ourselves, what part of me stopped growing when that happened? What belief about myself changed after I was hurt? What did I lose that I've never grieved? Sometimes we need to name not just the wound itself, but the loss of what could have been. The relationship that never felt safe. The parent who didn't protect. The friend who betrayed. The version of ourselves that never got to be. Naming the wound is not dwelling in the past. It is refusing to be ruled by it. And when we dare to name what hurt, we give God something real to work with. Not an edited version of our story, but the raw material of truth, ready for restoration. Real healing doesn't often come in loud, dramatic moments. It comes quietly, like light slowly stretching across a dark room at dawn. It's not always a breakthrough. Sometimes it's a softening. A thought that used to trigger panic now lands with less weight. A memory, once sharp, now feels dull around the edges. A tear comes, and instead of swallowing it, you let it fall. This is the gentle work of God, not erasing your past, but walking with you back through it, showing you where He was, even when you didn't know to look. We often imagine healing as an eraser, but it's more like a skilled weaver, taking torn threads and knotting them into something stronger. Not everything will be restored to how it was, and maybe it's not supposed to be. Maybe what's lost makes room for something more honest. The world rushes us to move on, but God is not in a hurry. He lingers. He stays in the hard spaces we try to leave too quickly. He knows the wound behind the anger, the ache behind the silence, the story beneath the mask. And unlike people, he doesn't grow tired of your need. He doesn't get uncomfortable with your questions. He is not counting how many times you've cried over the same thing. The Spirit moves slowly, tenderly, because the soul is delicate, and no two journeys are the same. This is not about forcing healing, but allowing it. Letting grace reach you in the unspoken places. Letting love stay long enough to soften what the world has hardened. You won't always feel the change as it's happening, but one day, you'll notice your heart has more room. Your breath comes easier. You can feel again, and it doesn't hurt to do so. There comes a point in every healing journey when you realize that pretending to be fine is more exhausting than facing what's really going on. The smile you wear to avoid questions, the polite, "I'm okay," you've trained your voice to deliver. The way you distract yourself with work, service, even faith, these are not signs of strength. They are signs of survival. And survival, though it served you once, is not the same as peace. True peace comes when you stop performing and start allowing. When you give yourself permission to fall apart if you need to, because God is not more impressed with your composure than He is moved by your honesty. In fact, it's often when we finally admit, "I'm not okay," that healing begins to breathe. Not because God didn't see it before, but because we finally did. The soul is never healed by pressure. It is healed by presence. And presence requires vulnerability. Surrendering the need to be fine doesn't mean losing control. It means releasing the illusion that you ever had to hold every. Psychology tells us that our emotional patterns are often formed in environments where our pain was not welcomed, so we learn to suppress, to hide, to numb. But healing asks us to do something radically unfamiliar, to feel, to trust, to open. Not because it's safe, but because it's sacred. And with every tear you allow, every fear you name, every breath you take without performing, you are giving God permission to meet the real you. And that's the only you He ever came to heal. Not all grief wears black or shows up at funerals. Some grief is quiet, slow-burning, and invisible, like the ache for a childhood you never had, the weight of a dream that slowly faded, the hollow space left by someone who's still alive, but not who they used to be. We grieve silently over betrayals we never talk about, over years lost to fear, over the version of ourselves we had to become just to survive. And because it's not loud, we convince ourselves it's not real. But the soul knows. It remembers every disappointment we pushed aside, every moment we said it's fine when it wasn't. Healing requires us to stop gaslighting our own pain, to stop explaining it away because other people have it worse. That comparison doesn't heal, it silences. And silence breeds shame. So we carry this grief like a quiet weight, wondering why we feel numb or heavy or disconnected from joy. But grief that is not expressed becomes grief that is stored in our bodies, our relationships, our faith. Unspoken grief becomes stuck energy. That's why healing often looks like slowing down enough to feel what we've been avoiding, giving ourselves permission to mourn, not just what happened, but what didn't. The apology that never came. The love that wasn't safe. The time that can't be recovered. This mourning is not weakness. It's sacred. And God, who knows the language of lament, meets us there not to fix it immediately, but to sit with us, to weep with us, to gently help us carry what we were never meant to bear alone. There is a strange kind of beauty in grieving honestly, because in that space, healing is no longer something distant. It begins to feel possible. Sometimes the strongest parts of us are built on the most fragile foundations. The independence we pride ourselves on, it might have started as protection. The emotional distance we maintain, a survival tactic we mastered when vulnerability became too costly. Many of the traits we're praised for, being unshakable, being self-sufficient, being so strong, are sometimes just well-disguised responses to unhealed pain. And underneath them, if we're honest, lives shame. Not the loud, obvious kind, but the quiet kind that whispers, "If I ever really break down, no one will stay." Shame doesn't always scream, "You're worthless." Often, it just tells you to keep earning your place, to keep proving you're okay, that you're useful, that you're enough. But shame is a liar with a polished voice. It keeps us from asking for help. It convinces us that weakness disqualifies us from being loved. Healing, real healing, happens when we begin to see that strength isn't the absence of need. It's the courage to let yourself be seen, even when you don't have it all together. Psychology calls this reintegrating the self, learning to welcome the parts of you that are scared, tired, unsure, and to love them instead of rejecting them. Faith calls it grace. The kind that doesn't demand perfection but welcomes presence. You don't have to be impressive to be loved by God. You just have to be honest. And when you start letting yourself be loved as you are, not as you perform, something inside begins to shift. The armor loosens. The breath deepens. And in that moment, strength is no longer a mask. It becomes a truth. You are already held, already enough, already being healed. Forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood aspects of healing because we often confuse it with forgetting, excusing, or instantly feeling better. But real forgiveness is none of those things. It is not denial, it is acknowledgement. It says, "Yes, this happened. Yes, it hurt. And still, I choose to loosen my grip." Not to let the offender off the hook, but to let your soul off the chain. Forgiveness is slow, layered, and deeply spiritual. It doesn't always come with peace at first. Sometimes it comes with more pain, because to forgive means you've stopped running from what happened long enough to face it. And yet, forgiveness is not something you create on your own strength. It's something you grow into, with God's help. Not for their sake, but for yours. Because as long as resentment stays in your system, it poisons more than your memories. It poisons your present. It spills over into how you trust, how you love, how you protect yourself. Psychology backs this up. Unforgiveness is linked to chronic stress, anxiety, even physical illness. But more than that, it blocks joy. It keeps your heart tethered to what broke it. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is radical strength. It is looking at the wound and choosing not to let it define your future. And sometimes, the person you most need to forgive is yourself. For what you didn't know. For what you tolerated. For the way you coped when you didn't have the tools. Healing doesn't always require reconciliation, but it does require release. And that release might come in stages, a little more each time you breathe, each time you pray, each time you choose to let go instead of holding on. This is sacred work, and it takes time. But you are not doing it alone. There is a silence that feels like absence, and then there is a silence that feels like invitation. When you're healing, the noise of life can become overwhelming. Advice, opinions, distractions, demands, they crowd out the one voice you most need to hear. The one within. Not your inner critic, but your inner truth. The soul doesn't shout, it whispers. And it needs quiet to be heard. That's why healing often asks us to step back, to unplug, to sit in stillness. Not to escape, but to return. In silence, what you've buried begins to rise. It's uncomfortable at first. The emotions you've numbed, the thoughts you've avoided, the fears you've silenced, they all show up like uninvited guests. But they're not enemies. They're messengers. And when you make space to listen, not judge, not fix, just listen, you begin to understand what your soul has been trying to say all along. That you're tired. That you're grieving. that you need gentleness. Psychology calls this attunement, being deeply present with yourself. Spiritually, it's the posture of prayer that doesn't speak, but receives. Healing requires this kind of deep listening, not just to God, but to the parts of you that learn to stay quiet in order to survive. And in that stillness, something sacred happens. You begin to realize that silence is not empty. It's full of presence. God is not louder than your pain. He is quieter than your fear. And if you lean in close, past the surface noise, you may just hear him again. Not as a booming voice, but as a steady one. A voice that calls you back to yourself. Back to peace. Back to presence. Healing begins when we learn to stop filling the silence and start letting it speak. There will come a day when your pain no longer defines you, but it will still shape you, and that's not something to fear. Healing doesn't mean erasing what happened. It means transforming it. And when that transformation begins to take root, the scar remains, but it stops stinging. It becomes part of your story, not as a mark of shame, but as evidence that you survived. We often try to hide our scars, emotional, spiritual, even physical, because we've been taught that wholeness means looking untouched. But that's not how healing works. Healing is not about returning to who you were before the pain. It's about becoming someone deeper, softer, stronger because of it. There is a power in saying, "This hurt me, and here's how I found my way through." Not as a slogan, not as a sermon, but as a truth only the broken can tell. Psychology refers to this as post-traumatic growth, the idea that pain, when processed with support and meaning, can lead to profound inner strength. Spiritually, it mirrors the redemptive thread that runs through the gospel. Nothing is wasted. Not the tears, not the years, not the nights you thought would never end. When you begin to tell your story from a place of healing, not bitterness, you become a living testimony. You offer hope to others, not by pretending you were never hurt, but by showing that pain doesn't have to be the end of the story. You speak not from a wound, but from a scar, a place that's been tended, touched, and redeemed. And in doing so, you pass healing forward like a torch. Not by preaching, but simply by being the proof that restoration is possible. Healing is not just about feeling better. It's about becoming someone new in the deepest, truest sense. Not a stranger to yourself, but the version of you that's been buried under survival instincts, broken narratives, and the roles you thought you had to play to be safe or accepted. So much of our suffering is tangled in identity, who we think we have to be, who we were told we are, who we're terrified of becoming. But healing pulls back those layers. It says you are not your trauma. You are not your worst day. You are not what they said, what they did, or what they never gave you. You are not a project. You are a person becoming whole. This kind of transformation doesn't come from striving. It comes from rest. From slowly letting go of the internal pressure to fix yourself and instead learning to trust the gentle unfolding of grace. Psychology names this process individuation, the journey of stepping into your full self, no longer shaped by fear, but by truth. And spiritually, it's mirrored in the quiet work of the Spirit, shaping us not into better performers, but beloved children who know they are safe enough to rest. You don't have to prove anything anymore. Healing teaches you that presence is enough. That becoming who you are doesn't require a checklist, only surrender. And somewhere along the way, without forcing it, you'll notice you're laughing more, trusting more, breathing deeper. Not because life is easier, but because you are finally living as someone no longer trying to escape the past, but growing fully into the present. This is not the end of your journey, but it is a holy beginning. Healing often feels like a wilderness before it feels like a homecoming. It's that disorienting in-between where the old ways no longer work, but the new ways haven't fully taken root. You've let go of patterns that once protected you, but you haven't yet learned how to live without them. And in that space, it's easy to question if healing is even happening. This is the wilderness within, a sacred, untamed space where transformation is slow and often invisible. In Scripture, the wilderness was not a place of punishment, but of preparation. A place where God met his people in raw, honest moments, where manna fell daily, where identity was tested and rebuilt, and where dependence on him became more than an idea, it became lifeline. Likewise, our inner wilderness isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign that we're shedding illusions and beginning to walk by faith, not familiarity. Psychology tells us that change doesn't feel safe at first, even if it's healthy, because the brain clings to what it knows. So, in this wilderness, you may feel lost, unsure, even lonely. But don't confuse discomfort with danger. You're not breaking down. You're breaking open. And sometimes, the silence you feel is not abandonment, but the quiet hum of God doing something deep beneath the surface. In this space, you learn to listen more closely, to hold yourself with more kindness, to trust that roots are growing even when nothing blooms. The wilderness teaches you resilience, not by hardening you, but by stripping you down to your core, where you discover that grace was never a theory, but a presence that walks beside you when everything else falls away. One of the hardest and most healing lessons in this journey is learning to receive love without earning it. For many of us, love has always felt like a transaction, something given when we perform, behave, succeed, or make ourselves useful. Even in our faith, we sometimes carry this hidden belief that if we're good enough, holy enough, healed enough, then we'll be loved fully. But grace dismantles that. It says you are loved now, as you are, not once you're whole, but as part of becoming whole. And that truth is often the most difficult to accept because it goes against everything our wounds have taught us. Yet, real healing begins when we stop striving and start receiving. Not reluctantly, not with guilt, but with open, trembling hands. The psychology of attachment tells us that many of us were shaped by conditional love, so we develop insecure ways of connecting, always bracing for rejection. But as we heal, we begin to rewire that experience by encountering consistent, safe love, first from God, and eventually from others who reflect that love. Spiritually, this is the core of transformation, learning to be loved without condition. When we allow that love in, something in us begins to soften. The inner critic quiets. The shame loosens its grip. The fear of never being enough starts to fade. And it's not because we've convinced ourselves of our worth. It's because we've finally let ourselves be seen and loved by the one who never needed convincing. Healing doesn't come from fixing yourself into someone more lovable. It comes from discovering you already are and living from that truth, breath by breath. As you walk further into your own healing, something sacred begins to happen. You become a safe place, not only for yourself, but for others. You stop rushing people through their pain. You stop offering surface-level answers to deep wounds. Because now you know what it costs to face the darkness. You've sat in silence that felt unbearable. You've felt the slow burn of grief, the disorientation of letting go, the quiet miracle of being held by God when no one else understood. And that knowing births compassion, not pity, not performance, but deep, quiet presence. You no longer need to fix others, because you've learned that healing doesn't come from control. It comes from being seen and not abandoned. Psychology speaks of co-regulation, the way nervous systems calm in the presence of someone grounded and safe. Spiritually, it mirrors the incarnational nature of Christ, not saving from a distance, but entering into suffering, drawing close, saying, "I'm here too." And now you carry that same light, not because you're perfect, but because you're real. People begin to sense that they can show up messy around you, that they don't need to hide their tears, their questions, their process. You become the kind of person you once longed for. And what's most beautiful? You don't have to try. Your presence becomes healing simply because you've allowed healing to take root in you. Your story becomes a lantern, not blinding, not overwhelming, but steady. You don't lead people out of their pain, but you walk beside them through it. And that is enough. That is holy. That is what love looks like in flesh and bone. We often expect healing to come through grand breakthroughs, intense spiritual experiences, dramatic moments of clarity, powerful prayers that shift everything in an instant. And sometimes, yes, it does. But more often, healing comes gently, quietly, through the rhythm of ordinary days. It comes through making your bed after weeks of not caring, through replying to a message instead of isolating, through a slow walk where you notice sunlight for the first time in a while. It happens when you laugh unexpectedly, when you eat a meal without guilt, when you feel safe in your own skin for just a moment. These small acts are sacred. They're not signs of progress. They are the progress. Psychology tells us that consistent small behaviors retrain the brain more powerfully than occasional intense effort. Spiritually, this echoes the way Jesus often healed, through touch, through noticing, through meeting people in the middle of their everyday lives. Healing is not a performance, it's a process. It lives in brushing your teeth even when you feel numb, in praying one honest sentence when the rest feels too heavy, in choosing to hope again, even slightly. The world often dismisses the ordinary, but heaven does not, because God is present not just in the miracles, but in the mundane. And when you begin to honor the sacredness of small steps, you shift from striving to receiving. You no longer chase healing, you live into it. You let it become part of your daily rhythm, like breath, like light, like grace that keeps showing up, even when you aren't looking for it. Healing, after all, is not a place you arrive. It's a way of walking, step by step, moment by moment, trusting that even the ordinary holds holy ground. Healing is not a finish line you cross. It's a lifelong invitation into deeper relationship with yourself, with others, and with God. It won't always look dramatic. Some days, it will feel like nothing is changing, like old patterns still echo, like wounds reopen just as they begin to close. And yet, the deeper truth is this. If you are here, still breathing, still hoping, still reaching for light in the dark, you are healing. Not perfectly, but faithfully. Healing is not about erasing the past. It's about reclaiming your future. It's not about pretending pain never happened. It's about learning that pain no longer has the final word. You may never go back to who you were before, but that's not the goal. The goal is to become someone wiser, gentler, more whole. Not because you avoided pain, but because you faced it and still chose love. Still chose hope. Still chose God. As you continue this journey, remember, you are not alone. You are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, those who've walked through fire and came out radiant. And most of all, you are held by the one who never left, who weeps when you weep, who rejoices over every step you take toward wholeness. Let this be a reminder. There is no shame in the slow. There is no shame in still needing grace. Healing is not weakness. Healing is worship. So keep walking. Keep trusting. Keep showing up to your own soul. Because every time you do, heaven leans in. God sees. God celebrates. And God continues the work He began in you. Not rushed, not abandoned, but perfectly in time. Amen.